Remembers, what if the worst thing you've ever done was done with the best intention you've ever had? I want you to picture a man standing at a crossroads under a hard, indifferent sky, dust in his throat. Remembers anger in his chest. A stranger blocks the path, old, proud, commanding someone who speaks as if the road belongs to him. Remembers words turn sharp, pride answers pride, and in a flash of rage, the man draws blood and walks away. Remembers, he doesn't know he has just killed his father. That's the kind of story we're stepping into today. Remembers, not a story where evil wins because it is stronger, but where tragedy wins because the truth arrives too late. Remembers, a story where the hero runs from a prophecy with all the courage in his body. Remembers, and that courage ironically becomes the engine that drives him straight into its arms. Welcome to Empire's Historical. Remembers, I'm genuinely obsessed with how ancient people tried to make sense of a world that felt ruled by forces they couldn't see fate. Remembers, God's curses, oaths, the strange weight of a single decision. And if you've ever felt like life can corner you, no matter how smart you are. Remembers, this story is going to get under your skin. But before we go any further, if you want more episodes like this, remembers, where we don't just retell history and myth but step inside the human fear and wonder behind them. Remembers, hit subscribe. It's the simplest way to support the channel and give us the momentum to keep making the next one even better. Remembers, now let me take your hand for a moment because I don't want to tell you the tale of Oedipus like a textbook. Remembers, I want to walk through it with you the way it actually feels, like a door opening slowly in the dark. Remembers, like your mind resisting what your eyes are starting to accept. It begins as so many Greek tragedies do. Remembers, with someone trying to do the right thing. A king hears a prophecy, one of those prophecies that lands like a curse the moment it's spoken. Remembers, his child, the oracle says, will kill him and marry his wife. Imagine hearing that. Or imagine holding a newborn and suddenly seeing not a future but a blade. Remembers, the king does what terrified people have always done when the universe threatens them. He tries to outsmart it. He tries to cut the thread before it tightens around his throat, so the baby is taken away. His feet are pinned, scarred, so he cannot crawl back, cannot chase the life he was supposedly born into. He's left to die, but fate in these stories is not a villain you can stab, it's more like gravity. You don't defeat it by denying it. The child survives, he has found adopted, raised far from the truth. Remembers, he grows into a clever young man with a proud spine and a mind that wants answers. And because he's human. Remembers, rumor reaches him. A whisper here, a sideways look there, the sense something about his birth does fit. Remembers, so he does what a person with courage and curiosity does. He goes looking for the truth. He travels to Delphi. Remembers, and this is where I always feel a chill because Delphi in Greek imagination isn't just a place you get information. It's a place where your life gets written by a sentence. The oracle doesn't speak like a friend. She speaks like a blade wrapped in velvet, not clear, not kind, not negotiable, and to this young man. Remembers, she gives the prophecy again. You will kill your father and marry your mother. Horrified, he thinks of the only parents he's ever known. Remembers, he believes they are his true mother and father, and here's the cruelest irony. His moral instinct kicks in. He decides he would rather lose everything than become that monster, so he runs. He flees home. He chooses exile over risk. Remembers, and if you're listening closely you can feel the trap closing, because in Greek tragedy, remembers, the attempt to avoid fate is to deter away from destiny. It's the road that leads you there. On the road, remembers, at a crossroads he meets that stranger, older, commanding, insulted that a younger man once healed. Pride meets pride, and the young man Oedipus kills him and the attendants with him. No grand villainy. Remembers, no carefully plotted murder, just heat, ego, a split-second decision that cannot be taken back, and the universe, remembers, in its quiet cruelty, doesn't stop him afterward to explain what he has done. It lets him keep walking. Remembers, it lets him keep believing he is escaping the prophecy. That's what makes this story so frightening. Remembers, it does punish him with lightning. It punishes him with time. He continues to Thebes, a city under siege, not by an army, remember, but by a creature that feels like a living symbol of the nightmare we all share, the Sphinx. Lion's body. Remembers, eagle wings, woman's face. She does conquer with swords. She conquers with a question. What walks on 4 legs in the morning? Remembers, 2 at noon and 3 in the evening, and Oedipus answers without hesitation. Man. A child crawls. Remembers, an adult walks, an old person leans on a cane. The riddle collapses. The Sphinx throws herself from the cliff. Remembers, Thebes is saved. And this is the moment where the story could have ended like a heroic legend, monster defeated. Remembers, city rejoicing, the clever outsider, crowned as a savior, he is made king. And because the gods in these stories love symmetry, and because tragedy loves irony, he is given the widowed queen as his bride. Jocasta, his mother, years pass. And this is important because tragedy isn't always a scream. Sometimes it's a slow, remembers, comfortable life built on a lie you don't know you reliving. Oedipus rules well, he has children. Remembers, the city prospers. If you met him then, you might admire him. You might say, see, he escaped. Remembers, you might call him proof that the oracle can be beaten. And then the plague comes. This is where the Greeks become terrifyingly psychological. The curse doesn't just strike one man. Remembers, it infects the entire community. People suffer. The land withers. The city's health becomes the mirror of its moral sickness. But the oracle declares Thebes is cursed by unpunished blood, by a murder that has not been answered, a stain that has not been named. Remembers, Oedipus vows to find the killer, and again he is doing the right thing. He is acting like a good king. Remembers, like a responsible leader. He wants to cleanse his city. He wants to restore order. But the investigation is a noose he's tying around his own neck. This is the moment that always makes me think of real life. Remembers, how often the truth is something we demand right up until we realize it might be about us. Witnesses are called. Remembers, the blind prophet Tiresias is brought in, a figure who carries one of the most brutal lessons in Greek myth. Remember, sometimes the people who see the most are the ones without eyes. Tiresias speaks. Remembers, and his words don't land like information, they land like a curse. He implies what no one wants to say out loud. Remembers, the killer is the king himself. Oedipus reacts like a human being, denies, he lashes out, he accuses others. Remembers, he tries to protect the version of himself that can still breathe, but piece by piece the truth advances. Remembers, not as a dramatic twist but as a dreadful assembly of facts. The old man at the crossroads, the scars on Oedipus' feet. Remembers, the servant who survived, Jocastus' grief, the shape of the story snapping into place like a lock closing. And then the revelation hits like a physical blow. The prophecy has come true, not because Oedipus wanted it. Remembers, not because he was evil, but because he didn't know, because he was ignorant. Remembers, because the very actions he took to prevent the horror were the actions that created it. Jocasta cannot bear it. She hangs herself. Oedipus finds her, and in one of the most haunting acts in all of Greek storytelling. Remembers, he blinds himself with her brooches. It's not just punishment, it's symbolism. It's as if he is saying, these eyes saw the world and still didn't he see, let them never see again. He becomes the living embodiment of tragic knowledge. The moment you finally understand and the understanding destroys you, he begs for exile, he wanders. Remembers, a king reduced to a broken figure, guided only by the hand of his daughter, Antigone. Remembers, and if you've ever loved someone who made a mistake that changed everything, remembers. Or if you've ever watched someone fall from a high place to a low one, you can feel the ache of it. Remembers, it's not satisfying, it's not revenge, it's just loss. Eventually he finds a kind of sanctuary near Colonus. Remembers, and there the earth swallows him, his grave becomes a secret, kept by the gods. Remembers, even his death feels like it belongs to a larger pattern, like the universe is folding him away the way it folds away a storm after it has done its damage. Remembers, but here's the thing, Greek tragedy almost never ends with one person, it spreads, it stains generations. Remembers, it becomes inheritance. His children do not escape the curse. 2 sons, Eteocles and Polynices, fight for the throne. Remember, one is exiled. He raises an army. The famous 7 against Thebes marches toward the city. Remembers, and the conflict becomes bigger than a family argument. It becomes a war that breaks the spirit of the place itself. Remembers, the brothers meet at the gates and kill each other in single combat. Thebes survives, but it survives like a body after illness, standing. Remembers, yet changed. And then comes Antigone, the one who carries old honor. Remembers, the kind of honor that does care about convenience or political calculation. A new king, Creon, remembers, declares Polynices must not be buried. In Greek thought, this isn't just a harsh sentence, it's a spiritual cruelty. Without burial rites, a soul is left wandering, its exile beyond death. Antigone defies the decree and buries her brother anyway. And for that she is condemned, buried alive. The gods, in the logic of these stories, do not let that injustice stand quietly. Madness and death fall upon Creon's house. The punishment is not presented as a courtroom argument. Remember, it's presented as cosmic consequence, as if the universe itself insists that some lines, once crossed, remembers, demand a price. So when we say the tale of Oedipus, we're not talking about a monster slain or a city built. Remembers, we're talking about a man who tried to outrun a prophecy and discovered that fate isn't simply what happens to you, it's what your choices become when made under fear and incomplete knowledge. Remembers, it's the terror of learning that intent doesn't erase consequence, that innocence doesn't guarantee safety. Remembers, that searching for truth can be the bravest thing you do and the thing that breaks you. And I want to pause here. Remembers, because this is where I think the story reaches out beyond the ancient world and grabs us by the collar. Remembers, how many of us have been at crossroads and felt our pride flare? How many of us have demanded answers? Remembers, convinced that truth will set us free without considering that truth can also burn down the life we built around not knowing? Remembers, the Greeks were obsessed with that tension, knowledge versus helplessness. The moment where awareness arrives and feels indistinguishable from doom, their tragedies aren't about winning against destiny. Remembers, they read about dignity inside of it, about the human attempt to hold yourself upright while something larger than you turns the wheel. Remembers, and if that feels heavy, good it should, because this isn't just the beginning of a myth. Remembers, it's the beginning of a pattern that will echo forward into war, into oaths, into gods picking sides. Remembers, into cities burning for reasons that began with a single choice, because in Greek storytelling, one solved riddle doesn't end the story. It starts the next one. Remembers, and the next tale that will rise out of these ashes, the tale that will echo louder than almost any war in mortal memory, will begin not with spears. Remembers, not with fire, but with a wedding invitation, and one goddess left out. Remembers, and if Oedipus teaches us anything, it's that a single solved riddle can close one nightmare only to open door into something far larger. Remembers, because the next catastrophe in the Greek imagination doesn't begin with an army marching or a city burning. It begins with a celebration, music, while laughter. Remembers, and the kind of warm arrogance people get when they believe the world is finally arranged in their favor. A wedding. Peleus, a mortal hero, is marrying Thetis, a sea nymph whose beauty is the kind that makes gods gauze. Remembers, and the guest list is almost comically divine. The Olympians arrive like a storm of silk and thunder, carrying gifts that look like blessings but feel like ownership. Zeus is there, of course. It's the king who keeps order with lightning in one hand and politics in the other. Hera is there. Remembers, sharp-eyed and furious in that quiet way that suggests she's already cataloguing insults that haven't happened yet. Remembers, Athena, calm and watchful, sees the whole room like a battlefield. Aphrodite arrives like a promise nobody can refuse. Remembers, and then there's the absence. Eris, goddess of discord, has not been invited. Now, I want to sit with that for a second, because this is one of those moments where myth feels brutally human. Excluding someone doesn't erase them. Remembers, it concentrates them. It doesn't remove the threat, it refines it, and Eris is not the kind of being you can gnaw into harmlessness. She is discord given form. Remembers, she is what happens when pride meets insult and decides it would rather burn the house down than stand outside in the cold. So she comes anyway, but not with an army. She comes with an object, a golden apple, and on it was 3 words that might as well be a match held above dry straw. To the fairest, that's all, not a threat. Remembers, not an accusation, just an invitation to vanity, invitation that is also a trap, because in the Greek world, remembers, beauty isn't only aesthetic, it's status, it's influence, it's power, and the gods are not above petness. Remembers, if anything, petness becomes cosmic in their hands. Hera reaches for it, Athena reaches for it, Aphrodite reaches for it. Remembers, 3 goddesses, 3 embodiments of different kinds of authority, and suddenly a wedding becomes a courtroom. Remembers, no one can rule without legitimacy even among immortals, and no one wants to be the judge who chooses between queens of heaven. Remembers, Zeus, who has ended Titan wars and divided the universe between brothers, does something almost funny here. Remembers, he refuses to decide not because he can't, but because he understands the political cost of picking a winner. Remembers, he knows that if he gives the apple to one, he makes enemies of the other 2. And in Olympus, enemies dunk, they sabotage. Remembers, so the gods outsource the decision to a mortal, a shepherd prince named Paris. That alone should make you uneasy. Remembers, because when the divine hands the hinge of history to a human being, it's never because the human is safe. Remembers, it's because the human is convenient. Paris is the son of Priam, king of Troy, but he isn't living in the palace. Remembers, he has been exiled to the hills, raised away from power because of an omen, another prophecy. Remembers, another warning that this child would one day bring ruin to his city. You see the pattern already. Remembers, dawn to you. A parent hears fate whisper and tries to outmaneuver it. The child survives, the child grows. Remembers, and the attempt to avoid disaster becomes the road toward it, so Paris stands on Mount Ida. Remembers, and 3 goddesses appear before him like competing visions of what a life can be. I always imagine that moment with a kind of dread. Remembers, because it's not just choose the fairest, it's a test of values, a test of what a man will sell his future for. Remembers, Hera offers him power, kingship over all men, dominance, authority so vast it feels like divinity without the immortality. Athena offers him mastery, wisdom, strategic brilliance. Remembers, victory in war, the kind of competence that turns you into a legend and makes your enemies speak your name like a prayer. Remembers Aphrodite offers him love, but not just love, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Remembers. And if you've ever wondered why the Trojan War feels so endlessly retold, why poets and historians can stop saying it, it's because that offer contains a question that never stops haunting human beings. Remembers. What do we choose when we repromise the thing we desire most and ask to ignore the cost? Paris chooses Aphrodite. And in that moment, the apple doesn't just decide a beauty contest. It decides a decade of slaughter. Helen is not just a woman in this story, though she is certainly a person. Remembers. With agency and emotion and complicated motives that different tellings handle differently. Helen is also a symbol. Remembers, a spark, an excuse. She is the prize Aphrodite promised, but she is also the mirror reflecting the pride men, the rivalry of gods. Remembers. That's why the poets argue about whether she went willingly or was taken, because the truth isn't clean. Remembers, and myth is rarely interested in clean truth anyway. Myth is interested in pressure points. What matters is what happens next. Remembers, Helen has many suitors, princes and kings from across the Greek world once came to compete for her hand. Remembers, drawn not only by her beauty but by the idea of what she represents: status, divine bloodlines, legitimacy. Her immortal father, Tyndareus, fears exactly what any father would fear in that situation. Remembers that choosing one man will make all the others enemies and the wedding will become a war. So Odysseus, clever Odysseus. Remembers, always the mind behind the curtain, suggests a solution that sounds like stability but functions like a fuse. Remembers, all the suitors will swear an oath. Whoever wins Helen, all the others will defend that union and punish any who violate it. Remembers, they laugh as they swear it because young men always laugh when they believe words are harmless, but in Greek thought. What remembers, oaths are not just promises, they are bindings. They aren't merely social, they are cosmic. An oath, once sealed, becomes a chain the gods can pull. Menelaus wins Helen and becomes king of Sparta beside her. Remembers, for a while it works. The kingdom is strong, the marriage appears stable, the world seems to have settled. Remembers, and then Paris arrives in Sparta under the pretense of peace, protected by the sacred rules of hospitality. Guess right. In ancient cultures, hospitality isn't casual politeness, it's law, it's sacred. Remembers, it's the thin line that keeps civilization from turning into constant revenge. Paris sees Helen, and he sees a father's promise made flesh. Remembers, and here the story tilts into that dangerous space where you can fully separate desire from destiny. Remembers, Paris takes Helen whether she goes willingly, whether she is coerced, whether the gods cloud minds and twist hearts. As the versions shift like waves, but the outcome is the same. He sails back across the wine-dark sea. Remembers, and Helen is with him. When Menelaus learns of it, rage is not enough. Rage is almost irrelevant. What matters is the oath. Remembers, he calls upon it, and this is where I feel the machinery of tragedy click into place. Remembers, because the war isn't simply two kingdoms fighting over a woman. Remembers, it becomes all the kings and warriors of Greece are now compelled to join a cause they might not personally care about. Remembers, because they swore a binding promise years ago. That is such a brutally realistic idea, even under myth's glow. As how old commitments drag people into new disasters. Remembers, how decisions made in a different season of life when laughter was easy return later as obligation. Remembers, an obligation becomes blood, so they answer Odysseus of Ithaca, clever and reluctant. Remembers, the kind of man who understands consequences too well to enjoy them. Nestor, old and wise, carrying experience like a weight. Ajax the greater, towering and grim, built like a siege engine. Ajax the lesser, swift and fierce. Remembers, Diomedes, brave and hungry for glory. Idomeneus of Crete, steady as stone. From all corners of Hellas they come kings. Remembers, princes, warlords, until the oath becomes an army. But not everyone wants to go. Odysseus himself tries to dodge it by pretending madness. Remembers, sowing salt into his fields, performing insanity like a shield. And I love that detail because it's such a human move. Remembers, when trapped by social expectation, we sometimes try to become unreadable. We try to break the pattern by stepping outside the role. As it doesn't work. A clever envoy places Odysseus' infant son in front of the plough, and Odysseus swerves, revealing he is sane. Remembers, he is forced to join. And then there is Achilles. Achilles is a different kind of tragedy. He isn't a king bound by oath. He is a weapon bound by fate. His mother, Thetis, knows the prophecy. If Achilles goes to Troy, he will win glory. Remembers, but he will die young. If he stays home, he will live long but be forgotten. So she hides him among daughters, as disguised in silk, trying to trick destiny with Theta. Remembers, but the Greeks find him anyway, again through Odysseus' cunning by laying out gifts of jewelry and weapons. Remembers, Achilles reaches for the spear and shield. He chooses war, and I always linger here because it's not just he likes fighting. Remembers, it's that Achilles, even in disguise, cannot avoid himself. He cannot avoid the part him that wants meaning. Remembers, that wants to burn bright rather than fade slowly. He chooses a short life with a long echo. That's the Greek heroic ideal in one heartbeat. Remembers, they gather at Aulus, a fleet of 1,000 ships, bronze gleaming, sails like thunderclouds, the energy of departure. Remembers the intoxication of a cause, the feeling that history is about to be written, and then the wind does not rise. Remembers the sea sits still, the ships idle, the men grow restless, angry, suspicious. And this is where myth reminds you again. Remembers the gods are not background decoration. They are forces that can halt an empire with something as simple as silence. Remembers the sea cultures reveals the reason Artemis has been offended. The exact offense varies, perhaps a boast. Remembers perhaps a slain sacred stag, but the logic is relentless. Something has disturbed the balance. Something must be paid. Remember, the price is unbearable. Iphigenia, Agamemnon's daughter, let that settle before the war even begins. Remembers the Greeks are asked to sacrifice a child so they can go kill other people. Remembers some tellings soften it. Artemis replaces her with a deer at the last moment, spirits her away. But the most common, remembers, most brutal telling is the simplest. The blood is real, the knife falls, the king kills his own child for the sake of war. Remembers, and here the story's moral temperature changes. This isn't just a heroic adventure anymore. Remembers, it's a deal with the divine that stains everyone involved, because once you sacrifice your daughter to get favorable wins, remembers, what can you claim to be fighting for? Honor, justice, love, or is it something uglier, pride, momentum? The inability to turn back because turning back would admit the sacrifice was meaningless. The winds rise. As the fleet sails and the world changes, they land on Trojan shores not as raiders but as judgment itself. And yet even that word judgment feels slippery. Remembers, because the war is born from divine rivalry and mortal vanity as much as any righteous cause. It's a conflict soaked in contradiction. Remembers, Troy stands behind massive walls said to have been raised by Poseidon, Apollo in their own strange history, servitude and penance. Remembers, allies come to Troy from far places. The Greeks raid to feed themselves. The siege becomes a grim rhythm. It's 10 years of human bodies turning into statistics, but before we reach the famous rage of Achilles. Remembers, the Iliad's heart. I want you to notice what the war becomes in this telling, not a single narrative. Remembers, but an ecosystem, a place where oaths keep men trapped, where gods choose favorites, where pride makes retreat impossible. Remembers, where suffering accumulates so slowly that it becomes normal. And here is where the gods openly pick sides. But Hera, Athena and Poseidon favor the Greeks, Aphrodite, Ars, Apollo and Artemis favor the Trojans. Remember, Zeus tries to remain above it, but even he bends, pulled by family, by alliances. Remembers, by the strange logic that even the king of gods cannot fully escape the loom of fate. That's the thing Greek myth whispers again and again. Remembers, even divine power has limits. Even Zeus can be haunted by prophecy, by the fear of being overthrown as his father was. Olympus is mighty, but it is not absolute, and I think that's why these stories still work on us. Remembers, because they don't offer a comforting universe where the strong control everything. They offer a universe where control is always partial. Remembers, where even the rulers are anxious, where authority and fear are welded together. The war at Troy drags on. And by the time Homer's Iliad begins, it has endured 9 long years. Remembers, the Greeks have settled into their camps like men living inside a wound. They raid to survive, not just to win. Remembers, the Trojans endure behind walls, watching fields burn, watching allies bleed, living with that constant pressure of being surrounded. And then in the Greek camp, remembers, the tension that will fracture everything ignites from something that seems almost insultingly small compared to the scale of the war. Remember, dispute over captives. Chryses is taken and awarded to Agamemnon, Briseis is taken and awarded to Achilles. Remembers, the details matter not because these women are merely objects, but because the men treat them as symbols of status. Remember, proof of dominance, compensation for risk. In that brutal economy, a captive becomes a badge. Chrysis' father remembers, a priest of Apollo comes to ransom her bearing gifts. He approaches with reverence, with the assumption that sacred office should mean something even in war. Agamemnon scorns him. The priest prays to Apollo. Remembers, and Apollo answers not with heroic thunder, but with plague. A silent killer that moves from beast to man. Remembers, turning the camp into a place of coughing and death. Calchas reveals the cause. Agamemnon must return Chrysis. Remembers, or the plague will not end. The king, forced to yield, does so, but his pride demands compensation. Remembers, he takes Briseis from Achilles, and this is where the Iliad's emotional engine begins. Achilles does not see as a simple trade. He sees it as a humiliation, a theft of honor, in a culture where honor is your life's currency. Being publicly slighted is being publicly erased, so Achilles explodes. He calls Agamemnon greedy. Remembers, cowardly, he swears he will no longer fight for the Greeks, he withdraws to his tent, and with him go the Myrmidons, his elite warriors. Remembers, forged for war, from that moment the tide turns, without Achilles the Greeks begin to suffer, the Trojans press harder. It was led by Hector noble, doomed, duty-bound. And I need to emphasize Hector here because he is not the war's instigator. Remembers, he is not Paris who took Helen, he is not chasing personal glory like some of the other princes, Hector is the heart of the city. Remembers a husband, a father, a man carrying a whole people on his shoulders, ships begin to burn, heroes fall. The Greek camp trembles at the edge of ruin, and then comes Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion. Remembers, whether friend or lover depending on the telling, but always the one person who can reach the part of Achilles that isn't he made of rage. Remembers, Patroclus begs Achilles to let him fight in his stead, he wears Achilles' armor, he drives Achilles' chariot. Remembers, he leads the Myrmidons into battle, and for a brief time hope returns, the Greeks rally, the Trojans retreat. Remembers, but Patroclus, flushed with borrowed glory, goes too far, he reaches the gates of Troy, and there he meets Hector. Remembers, their duel is brutal and final, Patroclus falls beneath Hector's spear, and with him falls whatever restraint remained in Achilles' heart. Remembers, when Achilles learns of his death, the story's tone becomes almost elemental, this isn't ordinary grief. It's grief that turns into a storm. Remembers, Achilles howls not weeps, as if the world has broken a law of nature by taking the one person who made life bearable. And now the war becomes personal. Thetis brings Achilles' new armor forged by Hephaestus, armor that gleams like the sun. Remembers, a shield carved with the history of the world. Achilles returns to battle not for oaths, not for Helen. Remembers, not for the Greek cause but for vengeance, no one can stand against him, he slaughters men by the dozen. He overturns chariots, he stains the dust with blood. He chases Hector around the walls of Troy 3 times before they meet in single combat. Hector fights bravely, but Achilles is unstoppable, he kills Hector, and then, in the ugliest moment of triumph, he drags Hector's body behind his chariot. Remembers, circling the city day after day, denying burial, denying dignity. If you've been listening with me, remembers, you can feel the moral sickness spreading. The war is no longer about retrieving Helen, it's about rage feeding rage. Remembers, honor demanding more honor, grief turning into cruelty. And then one of the most human scenes in all of myth. Remembers, Priam, the old king of Troy, guided by Hermes, sneaks into the Greek camp at night. He kneels before Achilles. Remembers, he kisses the hands that killed his son. He speaks not as a king, but as a father, and Achilles finally breaks. Remembers, weeps, he returns Hector's body. For a moment war pauses, not because the gods declare it, but because a human plea cuts through the armor of hatred. Remembers, the Iliad ends there in funeral and shared grief, reminding you that even at the peak of heroism, the deepest truth might be sorrow. But the war itself does not end. Achilles will die struck by an arrow, sometimes said to be fired by Paris and guided by Apollo, piercing the only vulnerable part of him, the heel. Remembers, and the siege drags on until it reaches the moment that feels less like a battle and more like an act of fate, is does strategy. Remembers, the Greeks vanish one morning, the Trojans look out and see empty shores, the ships are gone. Remembers, and on the plain stands a colossal wooden horse, an offering, a peace token, a puzzle, a gift. Remembers, and you can almost hear Oedipus' story echoing here, because it's the same structure, a riddle placed before human beings. Remembers, and the question is not can you solve it, but will you understand what it truly means. Some urge caution. Priam hesitates. Laocoon, priest of Poseidon, warns them, beware Greeks bearing gifts. He hurls a spear into the horse. Remembers, the wood groans, something shifts, and then the gods intervene again, not to protect the wise but to trap the uncertain. Remembers, sea serpents rise from the surf and crush Laocoon and his sons. The crowd interprets it as a sign that the horse is sacred. Remembers, they do what people so often do when frightened and desperate. They decide the warning was the problem. Remembers, not the object being warned about, they drag the horse into the city that night, while Troy feasts. While the firelight fades into embers, a door opens in the belly of the beast. Greek warriors pour out Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, and others handpicked for the final act. At the same hour, the Greek fleet returns from hiding. Remember, what follows is not war, it is slaughter. Neoptolemus storms through the palace and kills Priam at the altar. Cassandra is dragged from Athena's temple, her warnings unheard again. Hecuba watches her city burn. Remembers, Hector's infant son is thrown from the wall so no hair can rise. Troy, once golden, once proud, becomes smoke ash in a single night. Remembers, Helen is found. Menelaus raises his blade and then lowers it. He takes her back to Sparta, and even that victory feels tainted. Remembers, because what is victory after 10 years of killing and a city turned to ruin? Remembers, what is victory when the gods used you like pieces on a board, and the story refuses to give clean closure. Remembers, the victors carry curses home, Ajax the lesser violates sacred space and is punished at sea. Remembers, Agamemnon returns with Cassandra and is murdered by his wife Clytemnestra, who never forgot Iphigenia's blood. Orestes returns later and kills his mother, pursued by the Furies for the crime of kinslaying. Menelaus and Helen return to uneasy rule. Remembers, their names never clean again. Odysseus, architect of the horse, will not see home for 10 years, wandering through shipwrecks and monsters. Was punished by Poseidon, losing everyone he loves. Even in triumph they are broken, and one Trojan escapes. Rhanes, carrying his father on his back and his son by the hand, guided westward toward Italy. Remembers, becoming the ember from which Rome will later claim its own fire. When I step back from all this, what hits me hardest is how Greek myth builds its tragedies like a chain reaction. Eris tosses an apple. Memperis chooses desire, an oath binds kings. A girl is sacrificed for wind, pride fractures an army. Remember, friend dies, rage becomes cruelty, a city burns. The survivors stagger home and find that home is no longer safe. Remembers, as if the myths are begging us to see something we don't like to admit. Enormous disasters often begin as small. Intimate choices an insult to vanity, a promise made too lightly, a leader refusing humility. Remembers, a moment where someone chooses short-term desire over long-term consequence, and maybe that's why. Remembers, even though this is the tale of gods and heroes, it doesn't feel distant. It feels like a dark mirror. Because who hasn't seen how one social slight can metastasize into a feud? Remembers how a single selfish decision can ripple outward until it becomes a catastrophe no one person can control? Remembers how comments made in laughter can later demand blood. This is what the Greeks called mora fate, not a simple destiny is fixed slogan. Remembers, but as a deep recognition that once the thread is pulled, the fabric changes and you cannot restore it to what it was. Remembers, and that's where my curiosity keeps circling back. If even the gods can be manipulated by pride and fear. Remembers, if even kings can be dragged by oaths they once treated like jokes, then what chance does a mortal really have? Remembers, the Greeks didn't offer comfort, they offered clarity. Their myths don't tell you can control everything. Remembers, they tell you can and then they ask the harder question, if you can control the end? Remembers, can you still choose dignity while the wheel turns? Because after Troy burns, after the heroes sail home into storms and betrayal. Remembers, after the gods punish the victors for what they did in victory, the world does simply reset, it shifts. Remembers, the heroic age begins to fade, the gods themselves begin to change in the way people imagine them. New forces stir beyond the horizon, old temples will one day go quiet, and if you stay with me, remembers, we were going to follow that shift not as a list of names, but as a living feeling, as the slow realization that even Olympus is not immune to time, belief, and the hunger of human beings for new answers. Because the myths don't end when the city falls, they transform. Remembers. And when the last fires of that heroic age begin to gutter, when the songs quiet down just enough for you to hear what's underneath, you start to notice that the Greeks were never only telling you who won a war, they were trying to explain why no one ever truly wins against what's coming. Remember, if you strip away the armor and the pageantry, Greek myth keeps returning to one obsession. Remember the feeling that something is already moving toward you, whether you're ready or not. The Greeks had a word for that pressure in the air. That invisible hand at the back of the neck, fate. Not a god you could flatter, not a monster you could stab. Remembers, not a tyrant you could overthrow, something older than all of them, like gravity with a personality. Remembers, like a law that does bother to announce itself, because it doesn't need your permission. They called it mora, sometimes singular. Remembers, sometimes plural, sometimes it was just what must happen, other times it wore faces, 3 sisters at a loom. Remembers, fingers working in the dark, one spins the thread of your life, one measures it, and one cuts it. The imagery is so domestic it almost feels gentle, spinning, measuring, snipping until you realize what's being described. Remembers, your whole life reduced to fiber, your love, your ambition, your pride, your last breath, something that can be held between 2 fingers. Remembers, and the truly unsettling part is this, even the gods live under that loom. Remembers, we like to imagine Zeus as the ultimate authority because thunder feels final, a bolt hits and the argument ends. But Greek myth keeps whispering a colder truth. Thunder is loud, not absolute. Zeus can punish, he can seduce. Remembers, he can negotiate, he can rage, but even he has to look up. Remembers, in a metaphysical sense, toward a structure that doesn't care who's wearing the crown today. Remembers, there's a reason so many of these stories feel like a man sprinting from an oracle only to run straight into the prophecy. Remembers, the terror isn't just that fate exists, it's that knowing about it doesn't save you. Sometimes it's the very thing that traps you. Remembers, And that's where oracles come in, not as fortune tellers in the cheap, modern sense, but as the Greeks' way of putting language on dread. Remembers, I've always been fascinated by the paradox of prophecy in these myths. If fate is fixed, why consult an oracle at all? Remembers, why climb a mountain, bring sacrifices, wait your turn, and ask a question you already suspect will hurt you? Remembers, but that's exactly the point. The Greeks didn't go to prophecy to change the future. Remembers, they went to prophecy to understand what kind of future was coming so they could decide how to stand inside it. Remembers, not to dodge the storm, just to face it without pretending it isn't there. The most famous voice of this strange bargain was Delphi. Remembers, where Apollo spoke through the Pythia. The setting alone feels like the world trying to confess something. Remembers, a woman seated above a fissure in the earth, breathing vapor, slipping into a state that is neither waking nor dreaming. Remembers, and then out of that trance words come, but never plain words, never instructions you can follow like a recipe. Always riddles. Always double-edged phrases that sound like clarity until the moment they bloom into disaster. That's what makes Delphi so psychologically sharp. Apollo isn't portrayed as a god who lies. Remembers, he's portrayed as a god who speaks in a way that exposes the limits of human interpretation. Remembers, your downfall isn't the prophecy, it's your confidence that you understood it. Remembers, the classic example is the king who asks whether he should go to war, and the oracle replies that if he crosses the river, remembers, he will destroy a great empire. He hears what he wants to hear, he crosses, and yes, an empire is destroyed. Remembers his own. That's the chill I can shake when I read these stories. Remembers, the Greeks seem to be warning themselves about the human habit of turning mystery into certainty. Remembers, we do it because uncertainty feels unbearable. We would rather be wrong with confidence than right with humility. Remembers, and Delphi is the mythic machine built to punish that weakness. But prophecy in Greece wasn't limited to Delphi. Remembers, the world itself was treated like a text you could learn to read if you were attentive enough. The rustling of sacred oaks at Dodona. Remembers, dreams that left you cold in the morning, the flight of birds, the twitch of a flame, the behavior of an animal at the moment of sacrifice. Remembers, even a sneeze at the wrong time could feel like the universe clearing its throat to get your attention. Remembers, and yes, on the surface it can look like superstition, but I think that word misses something. Omens weren't just random signs. Remembers, they were a cultural admission that humans are not in control in a world where storms destroy crops. Remembers, where disease arrives without warning, where one political decision can collapse a city-state, reading omens becomes a way of saying. Remembers, we are inside forces bigger than us, so let's at least try to listen. That listening gave power to seers, figures like Calchas in the Trojan War, or Tiresias in Thebes. Remembers, Tiresias is particularly haunting because he's often portrayed as someone who knows the truth and suffers for it. Remembers, his sight is not a gift you envy, it's a burden that isolates him. He can't see what everyone else is protected from seeing. Remembers, and when he speaks, people hear him the way we hear bad news, as an insult, as an attack, as something that must be denied. Remembers, there's reason tragedies return again and again to the same shape. Someone asks for the truth and then cannot survive it. Remembers, which brings us to the most terrifying landscape in Greek imagination because it's the one place where all stories end. And regardless of how heroic they begin, Hades, not hell in the later moralized, fiery sense. It was not a place where the wicked roast while the good sing hymns forever. The Greek underworld is colder. Remembers, older, and in its own way more honest. It's not primarily a punishment, it's a destination, the house every living thing eventually enters. Remembers, whether it arrived there as a king or a beggar, even the name is heavy, mortals hesitate to say Hades aloud. Remembers, they call him Plauton instead, the wealthy one, because all wealth, gold, silver, gems comes from beneath the earth. Remembers, just as the dead do, that linguistic dodge tells you everything, fear so deep it becomes etiquette. Remembers, and then there's the geography, it's not logical, it's symbolic, 5 rivers, each a boundary you don't cross without being changed. Remembers, the Styx oaths and hatred, a river so sacred that even gods swear by it and shudder, Acheron sorrow. Remembers, Phlegethon fire, Cocytus lamentation, Lith forgetfulness, the soft eraser at the edge of memory. Remembers, I can't help thinking that these rivers are less like a map and more like a diagnosis of what death to a human life. Remembers, it turns everything into memory, and then eventually it turns memory into silence. The dead arrive as shades thin. Remembers, breathless versions of themselves drifting toward the ferryman. Charon, the fee is a coin, and suddenly burial isn't just a ritual. Remembers, it's a necessity. Without the rites, without the coin, a soul can be stranded, wandering the shore for years. Remembers, whispering and weeping, locked out not because of sin but because of neglect. And then there's Cerberus. Remembers, the three-headed hound whose job is pure boundary enforcement, keep the dead in, keep the living out. Remembers, a creature that does he tempt you or judge you just blocks you, like death itself. Beyond Cerberus lies the plain of asphodel, grey and dim, where most souls drift. It's not torture, it's not bliss, it's after. Remembers, a kind of eternal echo where you exist without the sharpness that made you you. That, to me, remembers, is one of the most unnerving things Greek myth ever imagined. Not pain, but fading. But the Greeks did leave room for moral gravity. There are judges, Minos, Rhadamanthys, Aeacus who weigh souls. Remembers, and there are three rough outcomes that feel less like reward and punishment and more like fitting endings. Remembers, Tartarus for the truly monstrous, a pit deeper than the Titan prison where crimes are mirrored by torments. Sisyphus pushing his stone forever, Tantalus starving beside unreachable fruit and water, Ixion spinning on a wheel. Remembers, these punishments aren't random cruelty, they're poetic reflections of obsession, betrayal, or arrogance, patterns of character that become cages. And then there are the Elysian fields for the rare few. Remembers, not heaven exactly, more like a gentler continuation where the air is soft, the meadows stay green. Remembers, and memory doesn't sting as much, a place where heroism is allowed to mean something beyond the grave. Remembers, and then, like a strange final option, rebirth appears, especially in later traditions and mystery cults. Remembers, drink from Lethe, forget everything and begin again. It's not framed as salvation, it's framed as recurrence. The wheel keeps turning. Now here's the part that always stops me. The underworld, for all its rivers and gates and judges, is ruled by a god who is not portrayed as flamboyantly evil. Hades is stern, silent, immovable. He doesn't crave worship. Remembers, he doesn't court human attention. He doesn't run around causing drama on the surface. He rules because someone must, and because death is not negotiable. Remembers, and beside him stands Persephone, the figure who turns the underworld from a static endpoint into a cycle. Her story begins with a fracture in the earth. She's gathering flowers and suddenly the ground opens. Remembers, and Hades rises in his chariot and takes her down. It's a kidnapping in many tellings, violent and swift. Remembers, and it triggers a grief so powerful that it becomes a cosmic event. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, doesn't just mourn, she withdraws the fertility of the world. Crops fail, rivers dry, famine spreads. Remembers, and the message is blunt. Civilization is fragile, your rituals, your laws, your wars, none of it matters if the grain doesn't grow. Remembers, Zeus, the king who negotiates everything like a politician of the cosmos, steps in not out of romance but necessity. The world can't survive Demeter's grief, so a compromise is struck. Persephone will return, but she has eaten pomegranate seeds, which bind her to the underworld for part of the year. Whether it's 1 seed or 6 depends on the version. Remembers, but the symbolism is consistent. You can go to death and return unchanged. You carry something of it in you. Remembers, and that compromise becomes seasons, winter as grief, spring as return. Remembers, I think that's one of the most beautiful and brutal metaphors humans ever invented. It says, life is not a straight line upward. It's descent and return, loss and renewal, and the return is never permanent. Every spring is temporary, as every joy is borrowed against an eventual winter. But the Greeks didn't leave these ideas floating as bedtime stories. Remembers, they built rituals around them, mystery religions that promised not public spectacle but personal transformation. Remembers, the Eleusinian mysteries, for example, reenacted Persephone's descent and return as a sacred drama. Remembers, the details were guarded, initiated, secret, and that secrecy is telling. This wasn't entertainment. Remembers, this was spiritual technology, a way of teaching people that death doesn't have to be only terror, it can be passage. Remembers, pattern meaning, and then Dionysus enters the picture like a wild contradiction made flesh. Remembers, Dionysus is the god who does fit neatly into the polished architecture of Olympus. He is wine and madness. Yes, but more deeply, he is the thin line between civilization and chaos. He is the mask that reveals truth. Remembers, he is the ecstatic surrender that can feel like liberation or like destruction depending on how you hold it. His myths often feel like warnings about repression. Deny the wildness entirely, and it returns as violence. Remembers, refuse the god and the god does simply sock, he dismantles your certainty. The story of Pentheus in Thebes is a perfect horror. Remembers, a king tries to suppress Dionysian rites, to spy, to control, and he is lured into the woods, dressed as what he mocks. Remembers, and torn apart by a frenzy that includes his own mother, who only realizes what she has done when the spell breaks. Remembers, it's one of those myths that doesn't end with a clean moral, it ends with a scar. Remembers, and out of Dionysus comes theatre, comedy and tragedy performed as sacred offerings. Which means the Greeks literally worshipped through storytelling. They confronted their fears in public, wearing masks, watching their own impulses embodied by actors. It's hard to overstate how radical that is. Remembers, the gods aren't just out there throwing lightning. The gods are also inside human psychology, desire. Remember, age, pride, grief made visible so a community can face itself. But even Olympus, with all its power, remembers, is not immune to fatigue. There's a late, bittersweet theme that starts creeping into these myths and their later retellings. Remembers, the gods begin to feel quieter, not weaker in raw power, but less present, less immediate, more like symbols than neighbors. Remembers, and historically you can almost watch that transformation happen as cultures shift. Rome rises and adopts the Greek gods. Remembers, but changes them. Zeus becomes Jupiter, more lawgiver than storm seducer. Hera becomes Juno, more civic emblem than raw. Remembers, jealous Queen Dionysus becomes Bacchus, more refined in public presentation even if his wildness remains under the surface. Remembers, Athena becomes Minerva, her fierce independence softened into a kind of state-sanctioned wisdom. It's not destruction. Remembers, its translation, but translation always changes tone, and then philosophy steps in like a slow acid. Remembers, thinkers mock the idea of gods shaped like humans. They question the morality of divine jealousy. Remembers, they propose that the divine is not a family of bickering immortals but reason itself, or an indifferent cosmos. Remembers, or beings who exist but don't interfere. The myths don't vanish, they shift categories. They move from religion toward literature. Remembers, from literal belief toward metaphor, and then monotheistic faith spread, carrying a different architecture entirely. One god unseen, absolute, moralized in a new way, and over time the old temple's close sacrifice is outlawed. Remembers, the Olympic Games are abolished, not with a final war of gods, not with Zeus hurling thunder at a rival heaven just to fade. Remember, retreat, statues left to weather, altars gone cold, marble cracked, ivy climbing. There is something almost hauntingly realistic about that ending. Empires don't always fall to invasion. Remember, sometimes they fall to irrelevance. Sometimes the world changes its mind. And yet this is the part that feels like magic. The gods don't die. Remembers, they move. They survive in texts copied by monks who don't believe in them but recognize their power as stories. Remembers, they return in the Renaissance not as objects of worship but as symbols of human nature painted in gold and marble. Remembers, draped in new meanings, they become allegory in the Enlightenment. They become emotional truth in Romanticism. Remembers, they become psychological archetypes in modern thought. They show up in novels, films, comics, wearing different costumes. Remember, speaking different languages but carrying the same ancient questions. What is fate? What is love? Remembers, was power do to a person? What does grief do to a world? What does it mean to be human when you are not in control? Remembers, that's why even now I can treat Greek mythology like a museum exhibit. It does stay behind glass. Remembers, it keeps stepping into the room, because under all the names Moira, Hades, Persephone, Apollo, remembers Dionysus, there's a framework that still fits the human mind. We still feel the pull of forces we can control. As we still search for signs when we're afraid, we still crave stories that teach us how to suffer with dignity. Remembers, we still want to believe that winter ends even if we know it returns, and maybe that's the deepest. Remembers, quietest truth these myths offer. The gods may leave Olympus, the oracles may go silent, the temples may collapse, but the patterns remain. Remembers, a girl descends and spring waits, a man outruns prophecy and collides with it. A mother grieves and the earth goes barren. Remembers, a hero wins glory and still dies young. The faces change, but the truths don't. So when you hear these stories, remembers, try to listen for what the Greeks were really doing. They weren't just entertaining themselves in the dark. Remembers, they were building a language for the parts of life that refused to be tamed by logic alone. Death, desire, there's fear, time, and the strange human insistence on making meaning anyway. And the more I sit with that, remembers, the more I suspect this is why the myths endure, not because they promise comfort, but because they refuse to insult you with easy answers. Remembers, they look straight at the storm and say, yes, it's coming, and then quietly, almost stubbornly, they add, now decide how you will stand. Remembers, and once you've stared long enough at those patterns, the loom of fate, the cold geography of the underworld, remembers, the gods fading into story, you start to realize the most unsettling twist isn't that the myths ended, it's that they never really stopped. Because what survives after Olympus goes quiet isn't a list of names or a family tree of deities. Remembers, what survives is a way of seeing the world, a set of emotional laws that still fit the human heart with uncomfortable precision. Remembers, and I think that's why these stories keep coming back century after century, even in an age that insists it has outgrown them. We didn't to keep Greek mythology alive because we needed Zeus to explain thunder. Remembers, we kept it alive because we needed language for the storms inside us. Here's the part that feels almost shocking when you admit it out loud. The Greeks weren't writing about gods. They were writing about us, only larger, sharper, and less forgiving. But their gods are not saints, they are personalities amplified until the consequences become visible. Zeus is power and appetite. As Hera is loyalty twisted into rage. Apollo is clarity that can still be cruel. Dionysus is freedom that can become frenzy. Remembers, and under all of them, like a bass note you can escape, there's fate, this sense that life has an architecture you can redesign. Only navigate. Even in a modern world, we recognize that architecture. Remembers, we still feel it whenever something happens that no amount of preparation could have prevented. A diagnosis. Remembers a sudden loss. A betrayal you didn't see coming. A global event that rewrote your life without asking permission. Remembers. We may not call it Moira, but we still say things like it was inevitable, or I should be known, or everything was fine until it wasn't. Remembers, and notice how human those sentences are. They re-attempts to grab control with words after control is already gone. Remembers, that's why the oracle motif still hits. The oracle is the ancient form of our modern obsession with certainty. Remembers, we scroll, refresh, we look for signs, we ask experts, we ask algorithms, we ask anything that might whisper. Remembers, here's what happens next, but the Greeks understood something we keep relearning. Remembers, knowing the future doesn't automatically grant power over it. Sometimes it just changes the flavor of your fear. Remembers, it turns fear into anticipation, and anticipation can be its own kind of suffering. Remembers, and yet the Greeks didn't use that as a reason to despair. If anything, their myths suggest a darker. Remembers, a sturdier kind of hope, not hope as it will all work out, but hope as I can meet what comes without lying to myself. Remembers, dignity within destiny, it's a brutal standard, but it's also strangely empowering because it doesn't depend on favorable outcomes. Remembers, it depends on how you hold your ground. That's the thread I can let go of. The myths are obsessed with control. Remembers, and then they keep tearing control away, not to humiliate you. Remembers, but to force you into a deeper question. If you can control the shape of your life, what can you control? Remembers, the answer again and again is your stance, your character. Remembers, your choice is in the narrow strip of freedom that still exists inside the larger machinery. Even the underworld myths echo this. Remembers, the Greeks didn't imagine an afterlife that cleans everything up with moral certainty. They imagined something colder. Remembers, where most souls drift in a kind of grey continuation, because in real life, most people are not saints or monsters. But they also insisted on one thing with almost obsessive seriousness: burial, remembrance, honoring the dead. Remembers, in other words, meaning doesn't fall from the sky. Meaning is made by the living. That idea is still alive in us. Remembers, we still build rituals around grief, even when we claim to be purely rational creatures. Funerals, memorials, anniversaries, little private gestures no one sees. We do it because forgetting feels like a second death. Remembers, we do it because love demands witness, and then there's Persephone, may be the most quietly modern myth of all. Remembers, not because it's ancient, but because it understands cycles better than we like to admit. Remembers, the world doesn't move in a straight line from bad to good, it moves through descent and return, winter and spring. Remembers, loss and renewal, healing and relapse. The myth doesn't promise you a permanent victory over darkness. Remembers, it promises you that darkness has seasons, that grief can be survived, that life returns, but it will return with memory inside it. Remembers, if you've ever come out of a hard year and felt like you were breathing differently, like the air itself had changed texture. Remembers, you know what Persephone means. She returns, yes, but she's never only the girl who was taken. She becomes. Remember, she carries the underworld inside her story. That's what survival often looks like in real life. You come back. Remembers, but you don't come back untouched. And Dionysus, he might be the strangest bridge between ancient myth and the modern mind. Because the Dionysian impulse is still everywhere, the hunger to lose yourself, to dissolve the rigid self. Remembers, to stop controlling for one night, to dance, drink, scream, laugh. Remembers, cry anything to break the spell of being civilized and composed all the time. Dionysus is a warning and invitation. Remembers, he asks, what happens when you repress the wild parts of yourself? The myths answer with disturbing clarity. They don't disappear, they return sideways, as chaos, as obsession, as violence. The Dionysian lesson isn't be reckless. Remembers, it's respect what you're made of, because denying human nature doesn't purify it, just makes it sneakier. Remember, so when we reach the end of this long arc, Troy burned, heroes dead, kings cursed, gods fading into the pages of history, it doesn't feel like closure. It feels like a handoff. The myths stop being religion and become something else, a mirror, a toolkit, a vocabulary for the parts of life that don't fit into spreadsheets and logic charts, and that's why they survive every end. Rome renames the gods, but the stories remain. Christianity shuts temples, but the symbols remain. Philosophers mock the myths, but the questions remain. Artists paint them, poets rewrite them, psychologists reinterpret them. Remembers, filmmakers resurrect them, and every generation thinks it's the first to discover that these old tales somehow describe the present. Remembers, maybe that's the real endurance of Greek mythology. It refuses to stay in the past. It keeps resurfacing because it's not really about ancient Greece. Remembers, it's about what it feels like to be alive in a world that doesn't guarantee justice, doesn't guarantee safety. Remembers, and doesn't give you the courtesy of certainty. And if there's one personal conclusion I can avoid after walking through all of it, remembers, it's this. The Greeks weren't trying to comfort you. They were trying to wake you up. They were saying, remembers, yes, fate is real. Yes, loss is coming. Yes, power is unstable. Yes, the gods or the forces that replace them do not owe you fairness. Remembers, and then they ask the only question that matters after that truth lands. What will you do with the life you were given? Remembers, knowing it can be taken, twisted, or ended without warning. That question is why the myths still murmur in the modern world. Remembers, not because we believe in Olympus as a literal mountain of gods, but because we still live under the same sky. Remember, still love, still fear, still grieve, still search for meaning, and still somehow keep walking forward anyway. Remembers, if there's one quiet truth humming beneath everything we've just traveled through, beneath prophecies. Remembers, oaths, monsters, gods, heroes, and burning cities, it's this. The ancient world wasn't obsessed with fate because it was superstitious. Remembers, it was obsessed with fate because it understood something we still struggle to accept today: control is never total. Remembers, and the price of pretending otherwise is often tragedy. Look at Oedipus, he set out to do evil. Remembers, he set out to avoid it. That's what makes his story so unsettling. The harder he ran from the prophecy. Remembers, the more his fear shaped his choices, until those choices became the very path that led him home to disaster. Remembers, and then look at Troy, a war that started from pride dressed up as justice and oath, a stolen bride. Remembers, a divine grudge became a decade of suffering, and when it finally ended, it didn't end with victory. Remembers, it ended with ash, grieving women, broken houses, and curses that followed the survivors across the sea. Remembers, in both stories the punishment isn't only what happens to the body, it's what happens to the soul when it confuses pride for purpose. Remembers, panic for wisdom and obsession for destiny. So what's the lesson for us right now in modern life? Remembers, it's not you can change anything, that's the wrong takeaway. The real lesson is you can control the whole storm. Remembers, but you can control what kind of person you become inside it. Fate in these myths doesn't crush people because they are weak. It crushes them when they refuse to see themselves clearly, when they act from fear, ego, hunger for status, or the need to win at any cost. The way out isn't magic, it's clarity. Here's how to apply it today. When you feel trapped, don't rush into dramatic decisions. Pause long enough to identify what's driving you. Remembers, fear, pride, anger, or love. Before you make a move, ask one brutal question. If I keep going like this, remembers, what will it cost me in 5 years? And when life hits you with something you can change, focus on the part that is always yours. Remembers, your integrity, your discipline, your compassion, your restraint, because in the end, remembers, the ancient Greeks weren't teaching us how to defeat fate, they were teaching us how to face it with dignity. Now I'm a curious, simple question. Which do you believe matters more in life? Fate or the choices we make? Remembers, drop your answer in the comments so everyone can see different perspectives. And if you want more stories like this told with depth, mystery, and meaning, subscribe to Empire's Historical to support the channel and keep these journeys alive.